Hi, everybody. I'm Shaun Roberts. I'm Head of Campaigns and Digital, indeed, at Unlock Democracy. And I'm joined tonight by, I'll let you introduce yourself. Yes.
Hi, everyone. And I'm Jess Garland, and I'm Director of Policy and Research at the Electoral Reform Society.
And Jess tonight is our polling expert. She is effectively the democracy sector's equivalent of John Curtis. So not sort of building her up too much for everybody. So what we're going to do, I'll be giving a little introduction in a moment, and then Jess is going to present some polling, and then we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A from you at the end. You'll see at the bottom of your screens, hopefully, a box that's marked Q&A. If you can ask questions in there, that will be great, and we'll pick them out when we get there. So anyhow, thanks everybody for coming. It's great to have a good turnout on this Thursday night. I'm just going to sort of start really by just setting out the scene for where we're at the moment. And, you know, I've been campaigning on democracy issues for over 30 years now, which I know there'll be people on this call that have probably been doing it for a good deal longer than that. And my general recollection of campaigning on democracy issues is that it's always been really hard, because you're always having to try and, you know, explain to the public just what the problem is. And you know, because it's rarely something that's on the front page of the newspapers that you're kind of trying to refer this to. And that's always been a challenge that we've faced. But in the last 2 years in particular, we've seen a really dramatic transformation in that it's actually been democracy issues that have started to move politics. In fact, you can argue it goes back beyond that, with Brexit effectively being an argument about taking back control, where you can't get a lot more democracy than that. But particularly these last 2 years has put the political system under a microscope that it's rarely been under before. And so people are actually talking now about politics isn't working, Westminster politics isn't working. And of course, a lot of this has been driven by, you know, the behaviour of prime ministers and various politicians and sleaze scandals. But for the first time in certainly any time I can remember, this is actually one of the top issues in the country. And even though obviously cost of living, NHS are up above it, in a lot of polls, actually, you'll see trusting politics, trusting government being a very, very important issue. And that's great news for us. I mean, it's not so good for the country, I guess, but it's great news for us because, you know, persuading people that change is needed is a lot easier when the problem is really visible to everybody. And that's been the issue. And the other thing right now is that very possibly we are heading towards a change of government for the first time in many years. And historically, I think certainly we've seen the last two times, in 1997 and in 2010, when governments change, there's an opportunity to get democratic changes with an incoming government. And that's a real opportunity to us. You think back to 1997, we saw devolution to Scotland and Wales, Freedom of Information Act, many, many more things. Obviously, not all the things we would have wanted, but there was movement in the right direction. And after 2010, there was an attempt to reform the House of Lords again, which obviously didn't go through. There was an attempt to change the voting system, which didn't go through. But, you know, despite those disappointments, we actually saw things happen. And, you know, potentially we were heading into one of those circumstances again. And then finally, before I hand over to Jess to sort of take you through the polling, there's, you know, in a two-party system we have with the current system, we have to persuade one of the two parties effectively to take up the cause of democratic reforms seriously. Ideally, we would persuade both, but in the current environment, there's obviously one party that tends to be listening slightly more than the other. There's been great progress in the Labour Party on these issues in recent years. There's been a fantastic campaign being fought within the Labour Party to encourage the party to back PR. Last year at their conference, 80% of local parties and the trade unions backed a motion supporting PR for general elections. You know, through the Labour Party, there has been real change in this issue. But the bit we haven't got to yet is, sadly, the most important bit, I guess, the bit at the top. And we think the real way that we're going to persuade the people at the top to adopt more of these democratic changes in their next manifesto and potentially in government is actually through public pressure. You know, and the reason we're doing tonight is actually trying to explain a lot more about where the public's at and what kind of things that might persuade the public to put that pressure on those Labour leaders who we need to get on side in order to get the change that we want. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Jess, and she's going to show us just what the public are thinking. Jess.
Brilliant. Thanks, Shaun. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak to everyone this evening and talk about the things that I love the most. So as you might have expected, I've put some slides together. So I'm now going to attempt to show you those slides. Hopefully someone will shout if you can't. There we go. So mainly I'm talking about messaging, because of course how we communicate with people is absolutely crucial for doing that very important thing that Shaun says, bringing a lot of people along with us and putting on the public pressure. But first of all, I'm going to talk a bit about our campaigning environment and what we know about it, and I'm going to try and be reasonably brief. Oh, it's not letting me oh, there we go. So first of all, what do we know about how people support the sort of democratic reforms that we're interested in? Well, it's quite healthy, is the good news. Support for proportional representation over the years is around the 41 to 45%. Reforming the House of Lords slightly higher, just over into the 50s, and citizens' assemblies just a bit lower. Now, at first you might think those figures are a little bit disappointing, but it's not, to say there's 43% of people supporting PR is not to say that the rest are opposing it. In fact, opposition is usually quite low, sort of 10 to 12%. What we have is a big chunk of people who don't take a position or haven't thought about it, or simply don't know. And that's across a lot of constitutional reforms. It's not that people don't support them, it's just they've perhaps never encountered them before. So that's something that's really crucial for bearing in mind when we're talking about the things that we feel passionately about. But just honing in on PR. Now, I should say, actually, let me just go back a bit. What's quite interesting about all these constitutional reforms is there's a lot of overlap. So if you support PR, the likelihood is you're probably going to be quite keen on House of Lords reform as well. So often we're thinking about a similar constituency of people who are in favour of reform. There's a lot of overlap. So again, focusing in on PR, I think this graph shows quite well. This is from some polling we did a few years ago, and I would expect perhaps these figures to have gone up slightly in the interim. But we asked the basic question of support and opposition for changing to a proportional representation system, and you can see there's a really healthy around 50% there in the support or strongly support category, and much lower number opposing. But again, when we add up those neither support nor oppose and don't knows together, we've got like 30% of people in the middle there who haven't taken a view on it. And there are some demographic differences. So I've just picked out sort of age as one. Now we can see sort of broadly high support across a lot of the age ranges, and then it sort of drops, well, flips round actually with the oldest generation. Not much to read into this other than the fact that you can see that the neither category starts to go down with age as well. So as people get older, they tend to become more firm in their positions. Other demographic factors to be aware of when it comes to support for PR and a lot of the other constitutional reforms is that the strongest supporters tend to have higher education levels, higher income, and there's some similarities in the groups who are sort of more likely to support PR. There is, as I say, a broad spread, but there does tend to be a clustering, and I'm going to talk about that a bit more when we look at some segmentation work we've done. So don't worry too much about these little coloured dots here. I'm going to try and explain what these groupings are. So what we did is we took people support for PR and kind of grouped people according to where they sort of clustered. And this little red dot over there on the far left of your screen, hopefully, is a group that represent the sort of left liberal group. So on this scale, we've got support from PR running from north to south, and we've got social values running on the other axis, so from sort of strongly liberal side over to authoritarian leanings on the other side. And so we see that the real strong supporters tend to be more, and this won't come as a huge surprise, but tend to be more left leaning, and they also tend to be much more liberal leaning, tend to be older, and as I say, tend to have higher education and higher income levels as well. And so that's where a lot of support for changing to PR comes from, and of course read across to other democratic reforms as well. In the other side, we've got sort of a stronger conservative group represented by that blue dot, who are similar in terms of age profile. But I don't want to focus too much on those two groups. What I just want to note is that the red dot represents around 17% of the population and the blue dot around 20%. So right in the middle there, those other four groups who I would sort of characterize as being a bit in the meh sort of group around PR. They're not strong supporters, they're not really anti, but just perhaps in that sort of don't know. But that's around 60% of the population. So going back to what Shaun said at the beginning there, we're thinking about a national campaign, we really need to know how to engage the groups who are not super keen on our issues already and do make up a really significant percentage of the population. So now I'm going to go on to how we talk about the things that we care about. Or, let me rephrase that. That's a good place to start. We're talking about messaging and I'm already messing up. But how do we best communicate the things that we're campaigning on to people who perhaps haven't engaged before? And I think what's really important is to think about what's the point of messaging, what is good communication? And what it is I think sometimes people think that when we're campaigning, what we're doing is uploading our ideas and uploading our thinking to other people. And actually, that's not good communication. I'm sure there's many experts in the audience this evening who know this as well. It's really about connecting with how other people are thinking about the world, connecting with their thoughts and the way they see things, in order to kind of link it to what we're talking about. And someone Shaun and I know always describes this of, if someone's thinking of a circle, you can shout triangle at them as much as you like, but it's not going to land. So we're really thinking with our research, how do we understand where people are at so we can better communicate our campaign to them? Now, I think it's worth thinking for a few minutes about some of the specific challenges when we're campaigning on PR and when we're communicating in our PR campaigns or any other constitutional issues. Now, first off, there is this link, as you would have probably inferred from my earlier slides, between support for PR and political interest and engagement in politics. And so the more people get engaged and interested in politics, the more they're likely to support PR. They're also sometimes more likely to not be in favour, but they take a view because they know more about it. And this does create a challenge for us. And Shaun mentioned this at the beginning. We have to kind of explain what the thing is before we get on to explaining what the problem is, before we then get on to explaining our solution. Because obviously a lot of people just haven't engaged with the concept of electoral systems or other types of constitutional reforms before. And I think of this as a fairly unique challenge for us, because you can think of many other areas where this just wouldn't be an issue. For instance, if I was campaigning to save tigers from extinction, I might have to explain the reasons why tigers face extinction, and I might then present what my solution is to that problem, but I wouldn't have to explain to someone what a tiger is. So we've got this particularly unique thing where we're starting quite a bit further back in the conversation when we're talking about these constitutional issues. Other things that we found out, three other really important things that we found out through our research, and it's really embedded in talking to people, doing focus groups, really trying to find out where people are at. We see a lot of the time that people think about politics and they understand politics in terms of people and personalities and parties. So they're not thinking about systems. We often think about systems. I'm the worst for this. I think about systems all the time. We're not dealing with people, but other people are thinking, when they're thinking about both what's good and bad about politics, is they're often thinking about the politicians. And that leads to the idea that, well, if you just change the parties or the people or the politicians, then you get a better politics. And we're often thinking, well, actually, it's the system that's corrupting things. You've got to change the system. So that's a challenge. The other thing that is really prevalent when we're talking to people is that they consider the alternative to, when we say, you know, the problems with democracy, they're thinking, but we are a democracy, we're not Russia, we're not North Korea. So it's a kind of binary thing where you either are a democracy or you're not a democracy. So rather than this kind of like gradations of good and bad democracy, that is the way that we think about things. And there's one final kind of strong thing that comes out of talking to people, is that when you do start explaining the problem, sometimes it's so big that people just go, well, that's never going to change. That's too huge. We can't, that's terrible. There's nothing to be done. And it really can lead to fatalism about the possibility of things being better. And I know for many of us who have campaigned, sometimes it can feel like that too. But it's a challenge to give people that sense of that things could actually change. So just going right back to basics, one of the things which I think has been quite interesting is the study we've done on how people feel about democracy. And I think what's really interesting here is democracy really has a very positive value association for people. So that people associate democracy with freedom, with fairness, and with like a really strong sense of pride. People are really proud in the history of democracy in this country. And so there's always a sort of really sort of positive association when we get people talking about democracy. People also really link just having the right to vote to democracy. So they're not thinking about the ways in which they vote or how the votes are counted. They're thinking just, I get to vote, so therefore we have a democracy. And that goes back to the sort of comparison with countries where people don't have a right to vote, or where it's heavily guarded, and so there's a really sort of either or here. I get to vote, so yes, we do have democracy. So people don't think that democracy is broken. This is something that they feel is precious and is important. Having said that, that doesn't mean that they think that everything in politics is fine. And it will not surprise you, but when we do focus groups with people, there is a huge amount of frustration. It's directed at politics, it's directed at politicians. People talk about it being corrupt, dishonest, confusing, and a real sense that people feel hugely disconnected as well from decision makers and from political life. And some polling that we did with Unlock Democracy last year showed up some really high percentages of people really feeling that disconnect, and also not feeling like politics is actually effectively delivering. So, huge challenges there, I think, for just the functioning of politics. So as I say, people like democracy, but they just feel, it's not working. So from all this work we've been doing, we've kind of found some sort of top tips, let's call them, for talking about democracy and talking about the problems. And the first one is really, don't say that democracy is broken. It's not, democracy is not the problem, it's the political system. So, broadly put, democracy is great, the politics is bad. And that really, I was talking about squares and circles, that triangles and circles, that really, that really lands much better than if we're talking about democratic system, because when we talk about democracy, it kind of uploads the positive. So if we're talking about the problem, let's talk about politics. But don't talk about the problem too much. So as I said before, people can feel a bit overwhelmed by the scale of the challenge. Goodness knows we can too. And so they feel like, if we layer on too much to the problem, that they don't think that we can do anything to change it. And kind of linked to that, we really need to describe things as matching up. So the solution has to be the same size as the problem. So if we set up the problem as being massive, we need to offer like a massive solution. So it's kind of important to keep things in the size they are. And one of the things I found absolutely fascinating from the research is that a lot of the things that we're campaigning for that feel like really huge to us because they're so important and we know the sort of transformational change that they would deliver, actually for a lot of people feel like sort of just upgrades, just sort of simple changes. And that also really landed, if we talk about upgrading the system, and people really get that we've got a very old system and it's kind of out of date, and what's wrong with having a bit of modernisation and an upgrade, that all really kind of lands squarely in the sort of way that people are seeing the world and our democracy. And then some top tips for messaging on PR specifically. People absolutely link PR with the ideas of freedom and choice and fairness. We link these values together. They really do speak very much to the thing we're trying to campaign for. Swing seats is really something that lands with people, only certain people having the choice to decide the government. that's quite powerful for people and relatable as well. I mean, so many people do live in safe seats. And also, I said before about problem and solution, that links up, it really makes sense. The two things kind of marry really nicely for people. And then the final one is emphasizing people over politicians. So, this change is about giving people more power. It's not about electing politicians differently. I cannot stress how much, it's sadly that politicians are getting a really bad rap and just, it's a really negative association. So the more we make it about citizens, the more we make it about people, that's really good for our comms. Just one extra thing, I think, which I feel is a real positive. There's been lots of surveys and lots of thinking on, the values that sit behind democracy and what people want from their democracy. And there's some research from the Constitutions Unit's Citizens Assembly on democracy and some of the stuff that was coming out of our focus groups as well, which kind of paints a picture. And I've put up some of the values here, the values and principles that people say they want from their democracy. And I'm looking at the list and I'm thinking, well, for those of us campaigning on constitutional reform and PR specifically, these are the sort of things we think that a change in electoral system would point towards and would improve in our democracy. So I think I feel positive that the sort of things that people do want from their democracy, we have a good story to tell about. And so I think we can always be drawing on these values and principles of accountability, transparency, trust and honesty. These things that people want are exactly the sort of things we think that changing the system would help deliver. So I think there's something really powerful and good we can do there. And just to finish up, before we go to further discussion, we started a lot of this messaging work sort of pre-Partygate, way before the Truss Kwarteng budget, so much has happened. And in a sense, I think, as Shaun said at the beginning, there's a real, there is very much a platform for the conversations that we want to be having about improving politics. In many ways, the sort of demonstrating the problem is being done for us by Westminster itself. And so I just wanted to pull out some themes that have come out of more recent research at the beginning of this year. And three of the big themes that are really coming through at the moment are double standards, that there's different rules for politicians, that Westminster is descending into chaos. And goodness me, I mean, when I started campaigning on this, the argument was always first past the post gives you strong and stable government. And I just think, wow, that I don't hear anyone say that anymore. So that's really, really changed. But that sense of disconnect, as I said before, that is, if anything, I think worse now in some of the research that I'm seeing come through. So again, that's perhaps an issue for keeping, things in proportion, but people generally feeling very, very distant from politics at Westminster. And another change I've noticed recently is a much more openness to parties working together and certainly in the survey I mentioned earlier, we saw 62% of people say that they think that parties working together makes better decisions. And that's a huge change from, 10 years ago when sort of the idea of parties working together took a bit of a nosedive. So things like coalition and cooperation are no longer sort of the things you can't mention. And I think that's a really interesting change and something to be aware of. So certainly a changing public mood and one that presents lots of opportunities for us to be talking about the issues we care about. Just finally, a few thoughts on future challenges. I think we always need to be connecting these problems that we see to the system and not to individual politicians or parties. I think we need to always be making those links. Shaun said at the beginning that democracy is rising up the agenda, but there are always more pressing issues. The economy, the NHS, cost of living. We need to make links to the other things that people feel in their lives and show them the relationship between the decisions made at Westminster and the outcomes that they feel. And also, something that's just really useful is let's paint a picture of what's better. How can we talk about what life would be like under PR, what would be better about it? And I think all those things really help us to talk with much more clarity about the change we want to see. So that's areas where we'll be continuing to work on, and to, you know, bring some research and learning to how we campaign on them. So I hope I haven't run over time. That's me done with my slides. I'll stop sharing there. I can see some questions rolling in. Back to you, Shaun.
Great, thank you very much, Jess. That was fascinating. Perhaps I can sort of start of a quick question of my own while the questions are still coming in. And I'm going to just stick to one really. What do we still need to know? What are we looking at now in terms of polling? What are the next steps that we're kind of exploring to sort of enable us to move more people out of that meh category on democratic reforms?
Yeah, I think it's the sort of middle one of those 3 points really, which is, how do we really clearly articulate that connection between how decisions are made and the sorts of decisions that are made and the outcomes that people experience, and that's pretty challenging. But I suppose we all know that the shape of your politics kind of shapes the outcomes it delivers, but I don't think that's kind of a way of thinking about things that's really kind of resonates for a lot of people. So how can we make this link between the sort of day-to-day experiences and problems and the shape of politics? And how do we do that really succinctly when you've got kind of a 30 seconds to say it? A massive challenge, but if we could crack that, that would be sensational. And I think that it kind of it ties in all the bits I was saying about, you know, how you connect with people and the things they're thinking about and the way they see the world, and just drawing those links for people is really, really important.
Very good. So let's go to some of the audience questions. Do you agree that the real block to getting PR, in fact, is party control?
Yes. Am I allowed to give a one-word answer? Do I have to elaborate? It's really
well. Yeah, I think elaborating a little bit. I mean, obviously, fundamentally, at the end of this, people, you know, a party leader is going to have to say, you know what, this majority that I've got right now, I'm going to put in place a system that potentially will deny me of that majority. And that, you know, I think one of the things we know about PR is that it reduces the power at the top. It funnels power very much down into Parliament and ultimately down back to the voters than from the, you know, the Prime Minister or the party leader.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's probably the reason why we haven't got it yet, right? It's all about power, not just power of parties, but also sometimes vested interests. So there's a lot going on there, and absolutely, it's a very hard decision to make. And if you look at calendar, you can see exactly how cold people can go on PR once they win under a majoritarian system. So that's a big challenge, absolutely.
Cool. We've had a question by email about the dangers sometimes of relying on polling, because sometimes polling struggles to pick up sometimes underrepresented groups, ethnic minorities, young people. What do you say to that? Yeah, well, and the issues of getting good samples has been really well documented. If you think the election predictions that have gone completely, not completely in the wrong direction, but have been quite often, there was a huge kind of review into polling and methodologies, and a lot of pollsters have, you know, put a lot of work into that since, but it is difficult. And as you say, you've named lots of different groups that the pollsters really struggle to get in their surveys. And of course, the big problem is that, you know, the sort of people who respond to surveys are the people that you're often capturing. And we try and mitigate that as much as we can by using different methods, focus groups as well as surveys, and mixing and matching with different polling companies and methodologies. And also, you know, that different pollsters go about things in different ways as well. But always being aware of its limitations. And of course, when you know, whenever you're looking at a sample, you're not speaking for everyone, you're just getting a flavour. But also, yeah, mixing methods is one way of trying to mitigate some of that. Cool, thank you. So there's a question about can we, or even should we, focus on the success of the suffragette movement? This would be a powerful, positive, historical way to bring forward the concept. Oh, strange. Tom Breaker's just going to answer this question live. That could bring forward more women in politics and more fairness concepts.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and we've not long ago had the centenary of women's vote, and I was part of a group then bringing together women's organisations to really try and mark that centenary with more firm action, because here we are, 30% of both chambers only in Parliament, and there's so much further to go. Should we be adopting similar techniques? I don't know. I feel it's every campaign has the sort of, has to fit in its moment, but can we be inspired by it? Absolutely. And, when we're thinking about franchise and things like that, people never go backwards. So, it's really important that we keep kind of, pushing on them. Shaun, you just gave me a bit of they do sometimes go backwards. Well, and I'm thinking, there's an example I haven't thought of.
As is being well documented right now, is voter ID means that actually about 2 million voters in the UK, as you know, Jess, don't have the right ID, and therefore could lose their vote at the next election. And obviously we've seen from the US in particular the voter suppression techniques that are used to sort of prevent people registering, prevent people using their vote. So I think you're right. Potentially, maybe it doesn't get pushed back by law, like a really obvious by law thing, but there is definitely some pushback, I think, now. Tom, did you want to come in on this?
Just briefly to say that, of course, one of the things that Unlock Democracy and indeed ERS and a number of other organisations are trying to do at the moment is to stop the government shutting down future suffragette movements through the different bills that the government are pushing through. So the Public Order Bill, which clamps down significantly on a number of protest powers and would make movements like the suffragette movement much harder to get off the ground if they succeed.
Yes, but we had some good victories in the Lords this week on that, which those of you that are Unlock Democracy supporters and members will be getting an email about that tomorrow, I believe. Let's move on to another question from the audience. Most people, that's from George, most people's lives are local. So to what extent does the research inform us about thinking in different parts of the UK, particularly different parts of England?
It's a good question, and you can really only get into that sort of granular detail when you've got a really large sample survey. And as you say, like even within, normally surveys break down into regions, but within regions, there's huge diversity between sort of rural and urban. And so you have to really have huge surveys to understand differences within constituency areas. But you can get a feel for the sort of broad makeup of areas and broad sort of opinions. But again, it depends. When we're going into messaging, what we really want to do is find something that works for, a large group of people. We're not sort of doing different things for people in different areas. We're just trying to find what's going to connect with the most people. So we don't often always want to go that granular. And also when you go really granular, then you're picking up on sort of local issues that vary so much. So yes, we don't tend to get to that level of granularity with our surveys.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting things around this. If you think about what happened after the last Labour government was elected in '97, obviously Scotland and Wales voted for devolution, but a few years after that, there was a sort of much less well-known referendum in the northeast about a region having effectively a regional assembly, which was voted down. So the northeast at that point, said no thanks. We don't wish to have this, this extra devolution. Had that referendum gone a different way, we might have seen more devolution to regions around the country at that time, and that kind of looks like it was killed stone dead. And I think more recently now we see Labour talking about a take back control bill, effectively to try and do that English devolution again, and maybe maybe some of the sort of the regions that were much more, I guess, pro-Brexit, some of the driver for that was they felt ignored by the government in Westminster, and perhaps this is the way that this, increased devolution is how that is tackled. What do you think about that?
It was amazing how influential that lost referendum was on taking the regional government question off the agenda for so long. It really had quite an impact, and yes, and a lineage from the No campaign in that referendum onto future No campaigns as well, incidentally. But yeah, it's fascinating now that all of that is on its back on the table. And the regional issue is difficult because it's not a sort of easy way to go about things. And there is a case for having more asymmetry, really. And I think that's come through in the Brown proposals, that it's much more, and this is something we recommended, it should be more bottom up, and we shouldn't have sort of areas imposed from Westminster, but you have to be quite comfortable with quite a bit of asymmetry for that really to come through. And perhaps actually that there's something there in that referendum, that it was a bit of a, we're imposing this on you. And I think definitely part of the campaign was, you don't want more politicians imposed on you from Westminster kind of thing. So, definitely going about it in a different way this time.
Cool. We have Helen from Make Votes Matter in Salisbury. Do you think that many younger voters need to have direct experience of their votes not counting before they realise the importance of reforming the system? Do they need to suffer a bit first?
They would ship all the young people off to a safe seat for several election cycles. Have experience of voting in the first place, and everyone always says it, but political education is really important. I think, when we were showing you the slides earlier, and that if you are interested in politics, you kind of know about the system, and then you go, oh no, this system's rubbish, it doesn't work. But you've got to get to that level of knowing about the system, and if you haven't engaged in it at all, then you're too many steps away from it. So voting full stop, really, in any way is the first step, and good political education is always key to so much, isn't it?
Cool. Got loads of questions rolling in there. Okay, so how do we encourage our MPs to be less confrontational and more solution based? I imagine PR might help a bit with that. Well, it might force an evolution in that respect.
Yeah, and that's what we all hope, right? That there's a culture change, that we get more grown-up politics, that we get kind of some sort of working round agreement, and where it's needed. No one's saying that we would take the politics out of it, but more grown-up politics. And I mean, some of that does obviously go on. I mean, Tom, I'm sure you'll defend the proper politics that does go on as well. But changing the culture so it's not just oppositional, I think that for me is a real PR win. And I think we can, expect to see some, or could expect to see something like that with a change of system. I'm sure it wouldn't happen overnight.
So the parties and Unlocked Democracy's cohabitee, we share an office for Best for Britain, as well as Make Votes Matter, actually, obsess about the gulf between national opinion poll rating and per seat polling. So actually, Best for Britain use what they call a MRP type poll. Is there a per seat element to what you've learned here, Jess? Or perhaps you just comment on the sort of two different systems and what the differences you get from them.
Yeah, oh my goodness, this has gone way geekier than I was expecting so quickly. But also I'm thinking I'm missing out on these conversations in your office, which sound really good fun. So certainly it's a bit like with the previous question, we're not looking at that sort of granular difference. And obviously, when you do polling, there's lots of different ways of going about it. I'm worried that I'm going to go off on a tangent now and get too into it.
Perhaps not get into the difference between MRP and polling.
We don't want to lose the numbers dropping down on the participants bar rapidly. Yes. Tom's got his hand up.
Tom.
I have, but in fact it was for the previous question, which was the question about consensus politics. Because of course, for consensus politics to work, I think there also has to be a willingness amongst voters that consensus politics it doesn't always deliver what they want. You know, there was a question in the chat about how can you convince the Liberal Democrats that in future coalition government would be a good thing. Clearly, the experience was not very positive, certainly in terms of the elections in 2015. So I think one of the ways of addressing that is actually to change the way Parliament works, so that Parliament, for instance, if there is were there to be a coalition in the future, that the independence of the different parties within the coalition is something that is still formally recognised in Parliament, because that was something which, I think, broadly speaking, in the period of the coalition, there was no formal recognition in the way that the House procedures worked, for instance, that there were still two parties, albeit in a coalition. So I think that's got to be part of ensuring that political parties want to engage in that sort of consensus decision making, consensus sort of policy development, because they can see that they're still going to have an independent position in Parliament.
Yeah. Good. So we've got a question about the House of Lords. If the House of Lords is reformed, will it lose its ability to ensure the government maintains the true democratic process of discussing proposed legislation?
I'm not sure I quite get the premise of that one, but there are some sort of like standard concerns that people have about House of Lords reform, Commons primacy, and we've seen through all the sort of House of Lords reform proposals that the suggestion would be to put some of those channels into legislation. So to kind of put on statute the Salisbury Convention, that manifesto commitments can be made, that the Parliaments Act, which allows the Lords to delay for just a year, would be maintained, written into law, written into the reforms, and that the Commons, by keeping the money bills and etc., would still be the primary chamber. So there's a sort of entrenching of those constitutional standards that most of Lords reform to this date has kind of just tried to go, we're changing the composition, but we're keeping the functions exactly the same, and we're writing into law to make sure that they stay like that. People say, but the Lords, if they had democratic legitimacy, would start behaving differently. That's a bit crystal ball gazing. But what I was going to say is actually that the one departure from that way of seeing things has been the Brown proposals, which actually have slightly changed the functions and changed the powers. So we've gone from sort of different composition, broadly the same powers, to slightly changed powers, as well as a difference in composition. So I think that's something really interesting, and I'm looking forward to seeing how those proposals develop, and we'll certainly be seeking to feed into them.
Cool.
I'm sorry if that hasn't answered your question, and if I've misunderstood the question, sorry about that.
No, I think that's a good answer. You suggest that raising the issue.
Shaun, can I just briefly come in on that, because I think part of it's worth remembering that yes, some of the peers who are there at present are effective legislators, but probably half of them are not. Half of them are there not because they have expertise or an interest in scrutinising legislation. They're there because they are party donors who may turn up once a year to make a short speech and then go off again. So I think you can perhaps overestimate the ability of peers as a whole to conduct decent legislative scrutiny. And I think if there's a process, whether it's hopefully not an appointment process for peers in the future, but a process that makes it clear that their role is actually about scrutiny, then you can maintain the caliber of the legislators who are there for the purposes of scrutinizing, as opposed to because they're there because they've donated large amounts of money to one or other of the parties.
Yes, and we should remember on the House of Lords, it's a few years ago that there was a report done by the Lords, I think, and it was agreed that the House of Lords was far too big, and since then it's grown from about 600 to over 800 peers, which is just kind of a crazy amount.
And more to come.
And more to come whenever Boris's and Liz's resignation honours list finally see the light of day.
A double header.
I'm going to bring it back to the messaging. The messaging. You suggest, this is a question here, you suggest raising the issue as the political system rather than the democratic system. I agree. This is Barbara. However, wouldn't it be better and clearer to specify that it's the voting system that's the issue, which I think that's a really, really interesting question. Which, do you want to...
Absolutely. And I think it is an excellent question. And you're right, when we're talking about what the solution is, of course, we're going to be there. But I think we've got to tap into where people think the problem is. And if they haven't really thought about an electoral system, and let's remember, when people think about electoral system, they might just be thinking about the way you go to vote. And as someone who's picked up the phone to the Electoral Reform Society many times, you know, there is definitely a gap. So electoral system is not necessarily something that's there, that people think about. Politics, politicians, these are the words that just keep coming back to us. That's how people are framing things. So I think when we're talking about the problem, sticking with politics, and then obviously when we've got to the solution, then we can talk about the thing we want. And we've got to, it's quite challenging. The best way to do that is to avoid being too technical, if we can. But yeah, definitely. I wouldn't start from the assumption that everyone knows about voting systems.
Yes, that they know, they go and put an X on the ballot paper, and then a winner is announced. What goes on between that is not generally something that's discussed, whereas brilliantly right now, the political system and how it's not working is something that's being discussed. So I like that the political system is kind of the key that gets us in to talk about potentially these other issues. And I realise that for an organisation that's called Unlock Democracy, what we're telling you here is don't mention the word democracy too much. Actually talk about politics and the political system. It is challenging, and we may even find out in future research that the best way to talk about PR is not to use the term PR. And you know, it could be that you start with the political system and then you move it onto things. But I mean, it's an ongoing challenge, and we are researching more of this. There's a question here about how can we from outside the Labour Party best help people campaigning for PR within it?
That's fantastic. And I think, yes, lots of ways. And really, I think it goes back to what you're saying at the beginning there, Shaun, about wider public pressure. It doesn't matter where that pressure is coming from, whether it's inside parties or outside. It's really important. And there's a lobby of Parliament coming up, which I'm sure you guys are going to be all informed about. And so that's something where we can really all galvanise around a moment where we're just showing the weight of support behind this. And that will have an impact on how all parties are thinking about this issue, whether you're inside the party or not. That's a really important moment for us all to show our collective strength.
Very good. Labour's 2003 proposals for England offered no real change in Westminster, i.e. life would carry on as it was before, and it would just add another layer of politicians. Voters in the northeast and campaigners in other parts of the country were not taken in by this approach, and that's kind of how this was rejected. How can, particularly given everything that's gone on in England in particular on devolution in the last few years, where London's very different to Manchester. Well, actually, London and Manchester are more similar in a way, but London's very different to many other places, and we have mayors at different levels. I mean, how can any government approach the sort of, what principles really can they apply to increasing devolution in this country?
Yeah, that's a struggle for everyone, isn't it? As I said before, the right approach is probably an asymmetric approach, where you're really sort of you start with a principle of subsidiarity, you start with the principle, but you will devolve to the level that's appropriate, and areas themselves, it's got to be a bit bottom up as well, and one of the things which has been missing a lot is identity and the areas that people feel that they connect to, and that actually, in order to kind of have groupings that make sense to people who actually live there, that certainly has to be a bit of bottom up, but that's deeply uncomfortable if you're kind of a national decision maker who's going, well, I'm giving away power, and it's all really messy. So you've either got to be like imposed from above and make it all cookie cutter, or allow a bottom-up, more asymmetric approach, which isn't going to be neat and it's not going to be tidy. And we've heard some Labour politicians say they're comfortable with a bit of messiness. So we'll just see whether that actually pans out in reality. Who knows? If the Brown reforms come through, that is the sort of approach that's being taken there. So that'd be really interesting. And I know, the single figure mayoral model isn't right in every circumstance. So I think a bit of deviation from that wouldn't be a bad thing.
I'm actually going to put this next question to Tom, which says, why do you not value the opinion of overseas voters who are very capable of looking outside of the UK on day-to-day issues?
Well, one of the things that we are campaigning on at the moment with the New Europeans and a number of other organisations in Europe is trying to secure overseas constituencies for UK voters, because we think that the representation of UK citizens living abroad with the current arrangements in Parliament is very ineffective, because what happens is that a member of Parliament may have 10 or 20 overseas electors who are on, in that constituency, but that member of Parliament will very rarely have the expertise that is needed to deal with complex immigration, pensions issues, for instance, that overseas UK citizens are confronted with. And France and a number of other EU countries and other countries around the world have a system of overseas voters or overseas constituencies for their citizens living abroad. And that just means that the people representing them in Parliament would be much better informed about issues in their locality, and the connection then between those MPs and those overseas voters would be much stronger, and they would have a much louder voice to talk about things that they're experiencing in the country they were living in, or their views of the UK and how the UK was being run. So we're trying to ensure that the views of those living abroad are better represented than is currently the case.
Yeah, and the extension of the franchise in the elections bill to more overseas voters, I think, really pushes that issue much more to the fore now. Right, back to you, Jess. Do you agree that the ID for voting requirement opens up a good opportunity to talk about and campaign about democracy, starting with the question perhaps of how many incidences were there of electoral fraud back in 2019?
I know the answer to this one. I can give you the figures. There were 33 allegations of personation fraud, 1 conviction and 1 caution, and 58 million votes cast. So I think we can safely conclude that it's not a widespread problem. We also know that there were 1,000 people prevented from voting during the handful of pilots of voter ID. So we are expecting that this could be really, really damaging in May. And we obviously hope that people aren't turned away, but the likelihood is that this is not going to go well. All the evidence suggests it won't. And so that will be a moment when people are thinking for sure about the voting process and their access to the vote. And, is the very concept of free and fair elections going to be challenged by this? I think it may be. We might even see election results contested on the basis of, if lots of people are turned away in a certain area. So there's a lot of risk, but it will be a moment as well, and one where we need to really keep the media eye on it, because it would be a travesty if people lose their vote. It's something that we need to be shouting about and really keeping an eye on. And will it be a moment for further reform? I certainly hope it galvanizes people to take our system really seriously. Unlock Democracy and Shaun and Tom have worked so hard with us as well on the elections bill, and we tried to stop this scheme being as restricted as it ended up being. And so it's kind of, it's almost a shame that now the bill's passed and there's there has been a lot more media attention on it. Now it looks like it's going to go wrong, but past the point when we could have stopped it happening in Parliament. Always frustrating, but that is the way. But yeah, there's certainly been a lot more media attention on it, which means there's a moment, isn't there, for us to really highlight it.
Yeah, I can definitely say you're going to be seeing a lot more from Unlock Democracy, ERS, and a coalition of organisations on this issue in these next few months. And it's just worth remembering that if just 2% of people are prevented from voting because of this, and this could be because they don't have the ID and haven't got the free ID. It could be they just turn up to the polling station, see a sign that says ID only, and they haven't got their driver's license or the appropriate ID with them, and they walk away. If it's just 2% of people that don't vote in that way, that will be 200,000 people that wouldn't get to vote in just the local elections this year. On a general election turnout, that would be 600,000 people. And as Jess said, one conviction, one caution. That is, it's breathtaking, and it didn't get the right amount of debate when it went through Commons in the first place. Hopefully, if it's even remotely like this, it will get more of the right kind of debate in future. I'm going to give you probably just one more question, because we've got about 3 minutes left. Do you think we need to increase the public's awareness of how alone we are in Europe and in other parts of the world in still using first past the post for parliamentary elections?
Yeah, definitely. That's a short answer for you. No, I think that's a really good point. And our head of media always says, and I quite like this, he said, this thing called PR, which most other countries call just a voting system, it's absolutely true. And I was speaking to some Canadians earlier today about obviously moves for PR there, and they weren't so impressed with the system that they'd inherited from us and were spending decades trying to get rid of. But yeah, absolutely, we're becoming more and more isolated, and yeah, it's an absolute outlier. And the countries who have still got first past posts are dealing with the dysfunction that it creates. So we have allies there as well. But yeah, PR, just a voting system for most people.
Brilliant. Well, look, thank you ever so much, Jess, for your time this evening and taking out of your evening to answer our questions.
A pleasure.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. If we didn't get to answer your question, feel free to sort of drop us a line on email. We'll try and answer your question the best we can. Please keep an eye out for our email tomorrow if you're on the Unlock Democracy list, as I mentioned earlier, and keep an eye out for our future events. And Tom, do you want to just finish off by saying something?
Yes, I just want to echo your thanks for people who've joined us, but just to remind people, I put it in the chat that the events that Jess has been talking about, the system, as we're calling it, which is in effect a lobby of Parliament to campaign or to talk to MPs about PR or equal votes or fair votes, if you prefer that way of describing it. If you're a member of any of the organisations such as ERS, Unlock Democracy, Open Britain, Fair Vote, etc., you will be notified of it. We're trying to get as many people to Parliament as possible on the day, so that MPs of all parties can hear from people who think that PR's time has come.
Yeah, 24th of May is the day, and we'll also be sort of trying to put in place arrangements where people can go and visit their MP locally if they can't make the trip to Westminster. We just want to make maximum noise with this, and really sort of put that pressure on. Not so long ago we'll come across MPs that would sort of say, well, no one ever writes to me about PR or constitutional issues. We want to make sure that no MP can ever say that again, and the need to do this is just more important than it's ever been. So yeah, thank you very much, people. We'll see you again very soon, I'm sure. Have a good evening. Bye.